In this series, we will pit the Atari 800, first released in 1979, against the Commodore 64, released in 1982. We will play the same game on each system. Only games from back in the 80s will be played and compared. We will judge games based on graphics, sounds, controls, and gameplay. Each system will be played with the same controller, with our judges being offered a choice between either an old-style joystick or a PS3-style controller. Each system is connected to the same CRT TV for gaming. All in-game footage seen in this video is captured through HDMI with the help of an old S-Video switcher to duplicate the S-Video signal of the systems and feed one to the TV we play on and the second to a RetroTink 2X Pro for upscaling to HDMI to feed into a capture card on the PC. No emulators were used for playing or recording the gameplay. Who will reign supreme? Will Atari rise to the top of Fuji Mountain? Or will Commodore's business as war approach lead them to victory? Find out now.
All right, well, welcome to episode 1 of Atari versus Commodore. The game is Bruce Lee. So you saw the intro, which kind of explains it, but I want to preface this series the fact that I'm an Atari guy from as a kid, but I'm going to try to not be biased. I never had a Commodore 64. I did have a VIC-20 before my Atari 800, but I'm going to do my best to be fair and balanced on this. Isaac has not ever played the Atari 800 for the most part, so he has no basis to any of these games. My wife has played some of these games with me over the years, and she had an Atari 2600 as a kid.
Yeah, I sure did.
But she really didn't get into these games that I'm going to be doing, and you're welcome to, in the comments, put games that you'd like to see us do. The only thing is we want to make sure it's a game that existed while the system was relevant, so in the 80s, late 80s, early 90s, not something brand new that somebody just did. All right, so let's go ahead and start talking about Bruce Lee. And while this is going, you'll see some videos of the games and maybe some of the things that we're talking about appear. Bear with us. We'll try to make this better every time. So what did you think of Bruce Lee?
I thought it was good. I enjoyed it. I wasn't great at it, and it was a little hard to get used to controls for a bit, but I enjoyed it.
All right.
I enjoyed it. I like the simplicity of the game. Not that I'm good at it, but from the standpoint of, games are just so much more difficult and so much more complex these days. So going back to these more simpler games and having, one concept of actually, getting the lamps and everything and just kicking and punching and just having a few controls, I really enjoyed it.
Okay. So as you saw in the intro, there was a choice. We used the same monitor on both systems. We used the same joystick. There was 2 choices. You could choose either my old Wico Boss joysticks, which are my original joysticks when I was a kid. They've lasted all these years with minor repairs. Or the other option was a thing called the Jest, J-E-S-T. And it is a circuit that was created by a woman named Techie Allison from the UK. And I bought a couple off of her many, many years ago. She was brilliant. Sadly, she passed away in a motorcycle accident many years ago, which was a huge loss because she was doing tons of great hardware for the Ataris. But that allows you to use a PS3 style controller on the Atari or the Commodore, anything that used that standard joystick. But they chose to use the joystick, so I went ahead and used the joystick also. I was going to use the controller because I kind of like controllers better now. And I think with the joystick, you started saying your hand hurt after a while.
It did. I could definitely feel where my hand was starting to hurt from, pushing the buttons, and I was trying to kick a lot and punch a lot, and probably more than I should have.
Did you get cramps at all from the joystick?
I don't think so.
All right, well, that's youth. So I did cramp a little bit at the end. So they would jump back and forth between each version. So like the different things that we're going to review, they would look at like graphics and maybe switch back and forth. They played the game multiple times on each system. One of the things I want to preface is some of my early footage was on the Atari 800 before I made a mod to it. You'll see here in the video that I'm showing right now, some of the whites and the brightness on the luminance was too much. And I found out online that there was a resistor that was not necessarily the best value for using S-Video. So I ended up taking the Atari apart, changed the resistor to the newer value, put it back together, and it made the quality so much better. If you look at like the white objects here on this first screen, you can see so much more detail, and the blue of the sky is blue. I don't know what you would call it, like almost like a purple.
Yeah.
So we don't want to give any knocks to the Atari for that, because it really, S-Video wasn't something that I ever used on it. I didn't even know it supported it. But we did use S-Video for both systems. But the quality dramatically improved on the Atari after we did that. Now we have envelopes. Mine is sealed. I don't think you sealed yours.
No, but I think
We sealed ours. This is the official, and I'll show you the criteria we have, but you can open up your information. It was handled by the accounting firm of Ernst & Young to keep everything safe. So we rate graphics, sound, controls, gameplay, and then overall. So that's where I keep it. So before we get too detailed, I guess I should have done this. Let's talk about the game. Bruce Lee, it's by Datasoft, 1984. It was originally written for the Atari first.
okay.
Ron Fortier, I believe is how you pronounce his name, he developed it. And then we had Kelly Day did the graphics, and John Fitzpatrick did the music. Now, Ron ended up doing the 64 version also, I believe. But the Atari was first, and the fun fact is he programmed the Atari version on an Apple II. Wrote the code on it, maybe he had a better compiler or assembler, and then sent the code over to the Atari or put it on ROM or whatever. So developed on an Apple II, but for the Atari. Then it was for the Commodore. They had versions for the Apple II, IBM PC, Amstrad, I think, BBC Micro. I mean, pretty much every system had it. And actually, the Commodore 64 has a sequel called Return of Fury, which I believe somebody took the original game and changed the levels and made a whole new game out of it. So it's still Bruce Lee, but it's like a sequel, unofficial sequel, I think. But the Atari was the first version. So again, that was 1984, and Ron also did Zaxxon first for the Atari, which we probably will do a comparison of that against the Commodore. And he also worked on Conan, which we'll be probably doing. And a fan favorite, he did the conversion. He didn't create the game, but he did the conversion of alternate reality, which was a very big, expansive RPG for back in that day. So long, and he went on to do a lot more games in development. Long history of great stuff. But this was a favorite game of mine. So let's talk our first category, graphics. What did you have for the Atari, and what comments do you have?
So I thought the graphics were nice. I gave it 4 stars. It seemed maybe a little less colorful still than the Commodore. It did have a bigger screen on our monitor, and I noticed that the vines you would climb up were different colors on the different systems. There was gray and dark blue vines depending on the level in the Atari. Do we want to talk about Commodore too?
Yeah,
Okay.
Go ahead. What'd you give for the Commodore?
I said they were also good. I thought they were maybe just a little bit more colorful. And then I also noticed the climbing vines were like a magenta color.
So you gave 4 to the Atari, but what'd you give to the Commodore?
I gave it 4.5.
So 4.5 stars. All right, what did you give for Atari and Commodore on graphics?
So I actually gave them both the same amount of stars. I gave them both 3 as far as the number of stars for Atari and Commodore. Now, I didn't really notice the details or the difference, as far as the detail. And then when you notice, or basically you put in the new resistor and everything, and you showed that to me, that's one reason why I went ahead and kept it the same as 3 stars for each. But I mean, I thought, they both looked good. Obviously, this is a game that's, was in 1984. So, you're looking at graphics, at that time. But as I said, I gave them both 3 stars.
So you don't think one was better than the other?
Not after you made the change.
Okay. All right. I gave 4 stars to the Atari and 4.5 to the Commodore. So we did a ditto there. I mentioned the Atari was just a little bit less colorful. And some of the effects there was better effects. Like Just so you guys know, they didn't get very far in the game. I got almost to the very end in my playthroughs, and at the end I'll have another statement on that. But there's like these things that you run over and they explode. It looks a little bit more colorful, the explosions on the Commodore. I did like the blue for like the stairs or the steps that you climb, the lattice like walls or whatever. I think the blue looked nicer on the Commodore. So I think the Commodore had a slight edge when it comes to the graphics. It just seemed more colorful. The effects were a little bit better. And one of the things that they didn't know, because on the Atari, both my Commodore and Atari, the disk drives work, but I don't have power supplies for them. So we had to play this with cartridge on the Atari, so it didn't have the title music. The Atari version, I believe, was written to be in 32K. The Commodore 64 obviously has 64K. So when you play the original disc on the Atari 800, you see that title screen with the music, and then it goes to that blue screen that lets you hit the keys to start. But on the cartridge version that we had, using a flash cart, you just go right to the blue screen menu. You don't get to hear the music or see Bruce Lee's face in the logo. The Commodore had that. But the Commodore was a 64K version. But if you play it on disc on the Atari, they're equivalent for the most part. All right, I'll start off on sound. I gave them both 4 stars on sound. I like some sound effects better on the Atari. And I know there's a lot of SID fans out there, and the SID's an amazing chip. Some sounds just sounded better. And I think because the Atari was first, that they maybe tried to clone some of those sounds on the Commodore. Didn't have the music, but that was the thing I mentioned earlier. I just like the Atari sounds better. So that was the only reason. I gave them both 4 stars. But I thought, for me, the Atari sounded a little bit better.
I was a little bit different. I actually gave the Atari 2 stars.
Oh, you're harsh.
And I guess I am a little harsher, aren't I?
Wow.
And then I gave the Commodore 3 stars. And I guess my thing was, it just seemed like the Commodore, it seemed to be a little bit clearer, and it seemed to be a little bit louder. And I think that was my main reason why I picked the Commodore over the Atari when it came to the sound.
Okay. Well, you have an opinion. It's wrong, but that's okay.
I gave them both 4 stars. I didn't feel like I really noticed a difference. They both had clear sound that seemed responsive to my movements and what I was doing.
Did you copy my homework? Because you're seeming to give the same numbers as me.
I think we just have similar opinions.
All right, so next we're going to talk about controls. Now again, this was using the Wico Boss joystick. So we'll let you go. What did you think about the controls?
I gave them both 4 stars. I felt that they both had quick, responsive, fluid movement. Sometimes it was a little hard to control, like when I was doing those diagonal kind of jumps, but for the most part, I felt it was good.
Okay, what about you? Oh boy, here we go, the hater.
So again, I gave the Atari 2 stars and I gave the Commodore 3 stars. It just seemed to me when I was trying to control the jumps and the kicks and the punches and everything, it just seemed easier and worked for me a little bit better on the Commodore than it did on the Atari. So, and I seemed to get a little bit further when it came to on the Commodore because of that.
All right, I'll allow that. Now, one of the things you may see in the clip here is one of the things she did while playing was every time she needed to, like she would run underneath a lantern and then you would have to jump up. She would punch. And then she would go all punch is punch, I got to jump. So then she'd push up to jump. The next one, right next to it, same thing. I'd say 85% of every lantern she punched first. Hardly ever got it. But that, I digress. So for me, I gave the Atari 4 stars on controls, and I gave the Commodore 4.5. So we are a little different here. I did feel like the Commodore was faster. The game felt a little faster to me, the movement and everything, which is actually weird. I believe, and all the Commodore people will probably correct me, I think it's around 1 megahertz, the Commodore, and the Atari is like 1.7 or 1.47 or something like that. So the Atari's actually clocked faster. But I don't know if this is a byproduct of just knowing the hardware better, or just better hardware. I know the Atari people will say Atari's got better hardware, the Commodores will say the Commodore does. But I just felt like the game played a little bit better for me control-wise on the Commodore, and I actually got farther than I ever did. And again, I'll mention that at the very end. All right, so let's go to gameplay. This is just kind of how you felt about it overall. For me, I gave the Atari 4 and I gave the Commodore 4.5. I loved the Atari version. That's what I played as a kid. My friends would come over and we would all play it. We'd try and try and try. And we would always get to the one screen that you're seeing right now. And we would always fail at the top part of it. We could never beat it. None of my friends ever did. So I loved it on the Atari. But I tell you, I just think it played a little bit better on the Commodore. A little bit better graphics. Sounds, I liked the Atari better, but it was still very good sound. And I just felt the controls were better. So I think gameplay-wise, slight advantage to the Atari, or to the Commodore.
I gave them both 5 stars. I felt that they both had at least similar gameplay. I didn't really notice a difference, and I felt that they were both really great games. So.
Okay.
And they were definitely both great games. The only reason why I gave the Commodore the edge, I gave them 4 stars over the Atari 3 stars, was again, the controls. It just seemed a little bit smoother as far as the gameplay. I could get further. So obviously getting further through the game makes it more fun. And that's the reason why I gave the gameplay a little bit better, 4 stars on the Commodore.
Okay. All right, and let's go ahead and overall, what did you give each one? This is kind of just summing up your overall feelings of the game.
Overall, I gave the Atari 3 stars and I gave the Commodore 4 stars.
Okay.
I forgot to write it down, but I'm going to give Atari 4 stars and I'm going to give Commodore 4.5. Only because I didn't really notice any differences overall except for in the graphics, which I felt were a little bit more colorful. So.
Okay. I gave the Atari 4 stars overall, and I gave the Commodore 4.5. And again, that was just because I felt like I did better in it. I don't know if it's easier. So I want to do a little side story before we declare a winner. I did a mod, and if you haven't watched Adrian's Digital Basement, he's a YouTuber who does a lot of Commodore, Apple stuff, lots of repairs. He's great. I love his content. He did a mod where he showed for the different Commodores how to tweak the video to get the best quality, like S-Video and composite. So I made the change that he recommended on one of our Commodore 64s that we picked up off eBay, or actually off Marketplace on Facebook. And it made it look better. So I recorded that, and you're seeing the footage from that particular system. And I went ahead and played Bruce Lee for the hell of it, and I recorded it. And I beat it. I went through the entire game. Never beat the game ever before. And I beat it. So if you don't want to see the end of it, you might want to close your eyes, because you're going to see the end of it here, or stop the video or whatever. But it's such an old game, I don't think anyone cares. So I beat the game. But I do feel like I played the Atari version after that thinking, okay, why was that so hard, that one screen? And I think the timing on that screen is easier on the Commodore. So I'm going to show them both here on the screen. The one part that always got my friends when we were kids, and I showed you that screen, and I couldn't do it on the Atari, and I still can't do it. But I did it first try on the Commodore, and then the next screen was literally the boss fight, and the game's over. So all those years, I was one screen away from winning, and the boss fight was kind of anticlimactic there. It was like, that's it, we're done. So for me, I think Commodore won.
I think Commodore won.
I think Commodore won.
All right, well, there you have it. Episode 1, Bruce Lee. It was close. My old faithful Atari 800, I still love it, but it let me down. And episode 1 goes to the Commodore. So we'll see you next video.
All right. Thank you.
Good luck, Commodore.
Thanks for watching.
Are you keeping up